the channels are just creating what people want to watch, not necessarily what they should be watching.
Exactly. But that's the thing, right? Could you ever spot a single drama serial that would even mention climate change? No. I mean, just, a student who's going to the college and says greenhouse, I'm talking about greenhouse gases right now. Let's focus on this. Not even a mention. I mean, forget detailed documentaries and other things. So, but that's very interesting, Daniel. I hope that you get to speak about it again. And Paul, what's your work?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Um,
So my work is basically iridium catalyzed borylation. So in this, let me speak in a
yeah, you need to
more.
explain what you're talking about.
I need to explain. So uh, in this work, so we are actually attaching the boryl group, boronic ester group to the in place of hydrogen. CH bond, we are replacing CH bonds with boronic ester, C boronic ester bond. So if we attach the boronic ester with C, the we can easily replace it with many other substrates, and this work has a lot to do in the industrial, is very important in the industry, and one of the hot research topics of today is the uh, catalysis of water. So water splitting, in which we split the water to make hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
So this work can also be utilized there, and I think this is related to the today's topic. So the we this is a renewable energy source, water splitting. So these catalysts can also do the water splitting in the future. Mm, in the future they can be promising candidates for this work as well.
Yeah, what's
And
funny, Paul, is that I did not put it in the list because I thought, what if whatever I'm already explaining is too much for students, and I didn't put it in. So I'm glad you get to cover it because I can then ask you to just come in and speak about, can hydrogen be really used as fuel, and how energy intensive is it? Has it been used in other
so I was reading last week a blog by Harvard. So they were writing, so the water splitting uh, is going to solve the environmental problems. So I was just curious about that. How is it going to affect the water cycle if we are going to, take the water and split into hydrogen and oxygen? Is it going to affect the water cycle? So I was curious about that also.
Yeah, so that's what I want you to do. I always want you to take this knowledge or the little that I'm teaching you back to what you're actually doing, or bring whatever you're doing into this class, just like you're doing right now, and enlighten everybody else on where the world is going. Hamza, so I'll take 2 more minutes and then we can start.
Yes, ma'am. I'm a computer science student as well, and my final year project is on power. So I'm working. My specific topic is soft load shedding. If the generation is lower than the demand, if a demand of a certain area or certain region is higher, then the utility company has to provide. How can we manage that? So it's related to that.
Interesting, very
Yeah.
interesting. And what do you suggest? What do you think is a good approach from what you've done so far? Like what have you learned?
No, there's several techniques to demand side management. So one of them is soft load shedding, and I'm working in more detail in that area. So we use data mining and data science techniques to identify the behavior of the consumers. Okay, like who consumes more and who consumes less, and be able to predict कि कौन ज़्यादा बिजली इस्तेमाल करता है, कौन कम करता है, उसके हिसाब से हम सॉफ्ट लोड शेडिंग जो है उसको स्ट्रक्चर कर सकें.
Interesting. आप सबके topics बहुत relevant है to today's lecture. So I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
all of your contribution in this. And I think Seemal had raised her hand. Seemal, are you still here with us?
Yeah, am I audible? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
yes, you are.
So I haven't opted for SPOT like in this semester, but I'm planning to do it for my last semester, and probably I will go for issues in economic policy since my major is economics and mathematics, and I'm taking a course in issues, and I really found it interesting, like to detect all the frauds and the inefficiencies that run in the government sector as well as the private sector.
Right. So very good. And okay, I think most of you are here now. So maybe I can just, should we discuss the articles that I sent you now, or should we discuss a little bit of the presentation and then go back to it? Just need to open the presentation. Okay.
Yeah, we can do the presentation first. Like in the last 5-10 minutes, we can discuss those.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's what I was planning to do as well, but I just wanted to take a vote and be a little more democratic. So right, I mean, we are, like I said, somewhere in the if you could mute your mics. I said, so we will just be touching upon the renewable and non-renewable sources of energy. And this lecture wasn't really initially planned because I thought, everyone knows a bit about all kinds of renewable energy. Everyone knows their pros and cons, and everyone also sort of knows about fossil fuels because there's so much discussion on this around us. But then I think as things unraveled, I realized that it's probably a good knowledge base to have, a basic foundation, because whatever we do, we keep saying fossil fuels are major contributors to it. Whatever we do, we say we should switch to renewable fuels. But how easy or difficult is that? And what do we mean when we say renewable or non-renewable? And do the renewables only have advantages, or are there some disadvantages of the renewables as well? So all of those simple topics, we'll try and look at them. And this is something that I found it yesterday, and I think it was really interesting. Perhaps people like Dr. Mahmood could reflect on this more, but we discussed in this lecture, in the very first few lectures, we discussed the natural capital and natural resource, and we've mentioned ecosystem services. And at some point during the laws, I also said that I don't understand how a monetary value is given, or an economic value is given to some of the natural resources as well as to some of the pollutants. Like how do you decide that if someone's polluting this much, then this is how much they'll pay? And that's, I think, where the experts in economics and other majors come in, who make those policy decisions, but based on data. So this is a World Bank tweet that said that Bhutan's only making 2% of its GDP from its forests. And one economic anthropologist said that, what do you want to do with them? Do you want to build IKEA furnitures? Because we tend to forget, or they did not mention the natural capital or the natural resources and all of the ecosystem services that this forest could be doing, not just for Bhutan, but for the entire region and for the entire world. So as long as you're able to make that connection, and because I found it very witty, I thought I will share it with you. And we have discussed this already. I am reintroducing some terms again and again so that people who haven't studied them in a while don't find it hard. So we studied, when we were looking at the electromagnetic radiations and atmosphere and radiations in general, we spoke about kinetic energy, that involves movement, and potential energy, for example, that's stored in a dam. And then I mentioned things like electrical, chemical, mechanical. They're all different forms of energy, and you know about them, you've heard about them. But if you could pick one, and if you could reflect on it, they are just the ability to do work in a certain way. So let's say in radiant energy, one form of its application is solar energy. So the radiation comes in, something happens in the cell, and then it's transferred as electrical energy to the people who are using it. So just for you to look back at the terms that we introduced, and the same terms on what's renewable, what's non-renewable, how do you categorize them? So anything that can be generated again and again because its source is present is renewable. And the fossil fuels that we've been, the infamous fossil fuels that we've been mentioning in the lecture in the form of coal, oil, or petroleum and natural gas are another reserve that have taken millions of years to be formed. And we are using them, but we have continuously learned about their negative impacts on biosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. And today we'll kind of compare that to renewable energy, but also look at how they were formed, also look at what they contain, also look at their pros, and try to understand the energy dynamics in general. Now, this is something that we discussed in the biosphere, and I want some of you to make that connection of what did we discuss, and what did you learn from. So we spoke about net energy. We looked at the food chain, and we saw certain things happening in. And although I didn't really mention it then, but we did speak about the laws of thermodynamics in action there. We said how energy flows from one food chain, trophic level, to another. And does anyone want to talk about it? Or no one wants to talk about it? Okay, I'll let Daniel talk.
One of the things we learned was that it's a lot more energy efficient to eat vegetables as compared to meat, because animals lose a lot of their energy in the form of heat. And that we related to the different levels of energy in the food chain.
Yeah, so we studied the food chain, and we saw that how energy is dissipated at one trophic level to the other, and how some energy is retained or assimilated. And then we said that in the form of excreta, some energy is released. In the form of heat, some energy is released. And sometimes the processes are inefficient. So between that transfer, the heat would just be wasted. So the second law of thermodynamics, that every time it converts from one form to the other, there would be some loss in the heat. And generally, when we talk about net energy, we don't think about the net energy in the natural spheres, right? So if I talk about net energy, I would also only say that the energy that comes to your household, for example, and provides you electricity is the net energy. How the coal is extracted, how much energy is spent on that, where it's stored, how it's transported, all of that is also energy, right? So the total amount of energy that's not only available in the coal, but also as a reserve, but also how much energy is spent on its exploration, transportation, storage, use, and even because you have to refine it, so refining, there's a lot of energy that's hardly ever taken into account. But even if you leave all of that behind and just consider the energy that the coal could produce, do you get all of that energy as it is into your household? You do not. There's a lot of waste in the process, in the transmission, and many other things. And I think that's the one thing that you should remember from the biosphere or the natural environment and the built environment, that wherever we're using energy, the net energy, that is the energy that's available to us, is the energy that has come after a lot of losses. So it's, that's the energy that matters, because that's the energy that you use. But if you look at the impact on environment, which is what we did in our meat consumption versus vegetable consumption, if you look at its impact on the environment, then I think there is a huge cost that we pay for those losses as environmental degradation. So we're already paying a lot in the way we're using it, even the net energy, but whatever we lose in the process is also costing us a lot. Now let's just quickly look at this and think of the different forms of energy that are available to us. We've mentioned wind energy, we've mentioned water or hydro energy, and we've also mentioned solar energy. And there would be a term called active and passive and the advantages and disadvantages, which is if you're using a photovoltaic cell or a solar cell, it's sort of an active way to harness it. But if you're just making good homes, using certain material in the household, trying to be efficient, trying to maximize on it, that would be a passive way to utilize it. Geothermal is the energy that's kept in the earth, and sometimes a lot of people, and especially power facilities in the West, utilize it a lot for electricity generation and other functions, sometimes even heating the homes. And dams are, of course, another form of energy where we use the motion of water. And it could be tidal, it could be marine, it could be just like flowing water under gravity. For example, the microhydral power projects that we have in the north and in Chitral, they just run off the whatever channel that we have that's used, and the gravity is used to run the turbines, which are placed at a lower place. So it doesn't use a lot of storage, because I think because of the fact that there's plenty of water and it's always flowing, and we don't really worry about the water not being available. So those remote areas, their power supply in the form of hydroelectric power stations is different, because it's damless. We don't build dams to do that. But on the other hand, there could be dams that are big, they're huge, that store a lot of energy, and they're used in the electricity generation. And the next thing, which is biofuel, is I'll explain it in another slide, but you can, using biological materials, so your excess food, waste food, or oil, grease, the oil that you use to cook your chips, or for example, the oil that McDonald's uses, they can turn it into a biofuel and use it again, or use it in combination with other fuels to reduce the pollutions in the environment. So that's biofuel. We're going to discuss it in a while. But what do you think about the net energy? How do you think does the net energy change for each and every one of them? How efficient and how, let's say, powerful do you think these different forms of renewable energy are? Can you think of any of them being highly efficient or has high net energy? Adeen.
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
A little bit. So if you speak, then I would be able to tell you whether I can hear you or not.
Okay, ma'am. I think that the solar energy is the most efficient one because in this case, even though like towards the sun, we have like ample amount of energy in it, but still the wastage is very less. Like it, almost all of the energy.
Okay, I think there's a little disruption, but I understood you. And I think I understood that you're saying that there's a lot of solar energy and very little from it can be harvested, and for multiple reasons, because there can be crop coverage, or in general, I think Hassan can shed some light on this. In general, solar or photovoltaics are not as efficient as we think. Their efficiency is somewhere between 40 to 70%, depending on how much sunlight we get and how much energy can be created, if I'm not wrong. So yes, their net energy can be low. I think can be medium, low to medium. Yes, Hassan.
It is actually much lower than that.
It's much lower than that.
Much lower. Currently, commercially available ones are at most around 23% efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And the world record right now for the most efficient solar cell is 46%, but it is highly unviable to be used commercially. We only did this in the lab. Currently, what I'm working on is exactly that. The thing that I'm working on has a theoretical efficiency of anywhere in the 60s or the 80%, depending on the conditions.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean that testifies it, because I've also read very promising reports about renewable energy, and my understanding was 40 is probably one of the best figures. But there are some commercial facilities that tell you that up to like it's 70% efficient. So we understand that the net energy for solar is not as great as it could be. But are these, so the discussion mostly has to be not just around net energy, but also around the environmental impacts of these different renewable resources that are available to us. So let's say if we speak about dams, and I think we've already mentioned it, are there any environmental consequences of this? And in general, I think hydro has more net energy compared to many other forms, but it's medium to high, not very high. But can you think of the environmental impacts of dams? Because we've already mentioned it in the hydrosphere. I had told you that today's class was going to be interactive. Bisma.
I think it leads to erosion because it blocks the flow of sediment, maybe.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. So I think one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is watershed. And by watershed, we mean that entire area, or let's say the drainage basin or water basin, is the entire area where the water is coming from to become a part of small streams, to become a part of rivers, and to become eventually a part of bigger rivers, and then flow towards the ocean and the seas. And just before the dam, and I think in the process of building a dam, you kind of, depending on how you're protecting your watershed, the siltation can be increased. So just before the dam or in the dam, the sediments come and settle. Now, naturally, the sedimentation flow is natural. But in the presence of a dam, it would be higher behind a dam and lower ahead of the dam. So I think that depression or that dip that we would create is another thing. And then because we're stopping the water body in the way, it could impact the aquatic life. I mean, it depends on how you handle it, but it's kind of putting in a barrier between the flow of the river. And Hassan has an addition. Hassan, you can say it if you want to.
Oh, I just wanted to add to the point. The chat was actually turned off for a while back, so I couldn't send it back then. But solar energy doesn't just need to be utilized through solar cells, right? The passive ways could be to have water being heated through sunlight, or you can have evaporation of water, because if you take salt water from the sea, for example, you can have the water be evaporated and be transferred to a different container, and it would leave the salt behind, so it would become available to drink.
Exactly.
So something like the first.
Or the process of distillation, where you heat up something and then you condense it, and then you expect that based on the boiling point, and because water has that property of being in 3 states, solid, liquid, gas, it helps its purification, especially for this form of passive harvesting of solar energy. And what do you guys think about wind energy? Of course, with the dams, I mean, there's that social side as well, that you are displacing people, you're displacing cultures, you are introducing some people to another area, which is kind of disturbing their culture as well. I think I think someone had raised their hands. Manuel, do you want to speak first? Or Mansoor, you can go ahead.
I think wind energy is not very permanent, because whenever the wind will flow, then only can the wind energy be harvested. So it is a condition that wind should be big. And it is also that the pace of the wind should also be greater to create more energy. So it also depends on the pace.
Yeah, so both solar and wind they kind of have to be available. So if I don't have a storage facility in my house and I'm running my house on photovoltaic cells, at least the electricity or the lighting in my house, and then I have a week long cloudy weather, then how does that impact if I don't have a storage, and if I don't have an alternative source of energy, then how does it impact my energy availability or my light availability? And the same could be said for the wind energy as well, that if it's there, and that's why most of the times you have them installed by the water bodies or by the shores, because you know that temperature regulation that we were speaking about, that water absorbs the heat and then releases it at night, and in that process the wind flow changes, and it helps for the wind speed to be higher around the shores, or maybe at a certain height. And you could say the same for solar cells as well. All right, and what do you know about geothermal energy, which is here? Come on, a new hand, guys. Someone who hasn't spoken today. Okay, so basically we know that there are a lot of radioactive materials, or in general there's lava under the tectonic plates. So depending on where you're extracting your water from, and depending on the level of that heat source, you could just send colder water inside and get warmer water. Or, mostly the energy that's harvested is in the form of water. So generally, even with this, like the water is heated, and that water is used to run the turbine. So even with coal, you would heat the water and then run the turbine based on that, the water body. Adine, do you have a point?
I have a question actually, that the water is pumped into the core of the earth, so like there would obviously a lot of wastage like of energy, like because all of the water cannot like flow back upwards in the pressure. So like it would be more productive for us to use that water otherwise in forming energy rather than just doing this.
Yeah,
So
so
like
I think it
wasting
depends on the priorities, Adine. So there are places, right? For example, there are places even in Tattapani, if you've heard, near on the way to Gilgit, or in a village called Hussaini, there are those hot water springs, which means that naturally the hot water is coming to the surface, and we could harvest that water directly. But sometimes when you know that there is a source somewhere, you could go the other way around as well. So generally it's the later, which I didn't mention before, that you have hot water springs, you have hot water available, and you're using that to warm your houses, or you're using that for power production. But sometimes if you know and if you've created that flow, then you could really use that as well. Dr. Mahmood, have you raised your hand?
Yes, I think because you mentioned that about the dams, the negative aspect, the environmental thing. I think this is one thing I like to mention here is the river flow downstream. I think in many countries, one of the problems with the dams is that there is a minimum flow that has to go out in the sea. So once we start constructing these dams, I think there are so many disputes, like in Pakistan, that water below Kotri there is not enough water that goes to the sea. Because if we don't send the water to the sea, then the water from sea comes in and it really destroys all the ecology. And this is what Sindh is talking about. So this one point is very important, which globally draws the attention. One point, another about the dams, of course, there is a long list of it, is that it crowds out investments. You know, average life of making big dams we are making is like 10 years. So huge, investment is crowded out, which we can spend it for very small, cost-effective environmental solutions. So these are the two things I would like to mention before you move on.
Yes, that is
Ma'am,
correct. Rivers have to have what is called the environmental flows, which means that the flow which is necessary for biodiversity as well as agriculture, as well as other natural services like groundwater recharge, evaporation, and in general water rights, etc. as well. So that is really important. Thank you, Dr. Mahmood, for mentioning it. Bisma, you have raised your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to add on the social like consequences of building large dams. I read somewhere like it actually causes displacement of people from their homes because of, so that could be a social consequence of building a dam, right?
Yeah, and that's also why one of the biggest resistances, for example, for the Diamir Bhasha Dam, the biggest problem was the locals not wanting to leave their region. And I think in the end they left it because they were given huge sums of money. And you can negotiate the trade-off for the two. For example, some people prefer home over money, and some people just make home with money that's given to them. But oftentimes dams are not built for the same social pressure, that people do not want to leave their homes and people do not want their homes to be destroyed, or because there are a lot of culture and heritage, and there's a lot of history associated with that space that they don't want to give up, as such. And that's why there's a lot of resistance. Azhan, I'll take your point and then we can discuss the next slide.
so ma'am, a question that like I would like to share with others, and maybe you can answer it if it's possible. So I was like, don't you think that construction of geothermal power plant will and damaging the surface instability and maybe trigger earthquakes or emission of toxic gases, because Earth do has some gases inside its core. So don't you think that this will definitely dominate the negative impact more than having a positive impact of
Yeah,
extracting the energy?
exactly. And then, what this brings to our minds is the fact that we've been doing this with fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are being extracted not only from under the ocean, but under the land. And you are going, and sometimes it's like huge projects, exploration projects, where you dig deep wells to find oil, to find coal, to find natural gas, and then end up leaving that space just filled with waste, because as we said, there's a lot of parent rock there that could contain a lot of these heavy metals or toxic metals or other components that we've been talking about. And I think now people are finally realizing that could be the case. And because geothermal is not too down, I mean, we can negotiate the pros and cons for all. And of course, that's why I kept the floor open today, that not everything is 100% yes, right? That there are some cons of every energy source, whether it's renewable and or non-renewable. But the difference is that the non-renewable energy sources, especially fossil fuels, are extremely dirty and have deteriorated our environment at a much greater pace. And in any case, we're going to run out of those resources. So if we've made those promises, then how do we live up to those promises? By switching to these non-renewable resources, but kind of making sure that in that process, communities, environment, and natural environments and biodiversity is safe. Yeah, did that. I hope that helped. But I want to move on to perhaps people in the bio and chemistry already know about this, the phenomena called biofuel, or the renewable resource called biofuel, where you're using natural resources, and it could be solid biomass, simply wood, where you're not cutting down the tree, you're just always harvesting the branches, using it sustainably to as firewood or as a source of energy. So it's a sustainable source in a sense that you're not cutting a tree down and you're only harvesting what could be harvested. So that's one source. But now people are getting innovative, creative in their approaches. So they're trying not to waste the waste from food waste or from crops. So oftentimes, for example, when you take corn or when you take any other fuel, the rest of it is fodder. And sometimes the rest of it is not even fodder for animals. And that biomass is often wasted. or majorly in the forms of grass. It's just lying there, right? So what has happened now, and I think this is contribution of a lot of chemists and biologists all together, where microorganisms or different reactions have been introduced into this, different reaction conditions have been introduced. So for example, for bioethanol production, you use the sugar, the algae, or the sugar beet, which is rich in carbohydrates. And we know carbohydrate is sugar, right? Basic sugar. And it is fermented to form ethanol or an alcohol, which could be a source of fuel. And this fuel is now being mixed with, in what you know or you learn about as the hybrid cars, or the cars that could take a certain concentration of bioethanol with an existing coal fuel. So the oil is mixed with bioethanol. And there are all these interventions that are taking place to reduce the load of pollution on the environment. And then, there's biodiesel. So like I said, the vegetables, oils that we use, the animal fats that are available, they could be used to create biodiesel. And again, it can be used directly on its own or in combination with the diesel, which comes from the petroleum. Or biomethane. And biomethane is very often with the help of microorganisms. So I think Fateh had once mentioned that in the cow stomach, there are these microorganisms that are able to produce methane gases or biogases, or it's found in the manure in general or in the organic waste. Basically, those bacteria need anaerobic condition to degrade the food waste into methane. And sometimes methane is found outside of dump sites and has been, if you look at certain landfills, you'll see that there is a small chimney which always has fire on top of this. And that is actually a methane or biomethane, as you could call it. Does someone have a question or a comment? Okay, so like we said, there is a trade-off. I think I'd mentioned somewhere in one of the previous lectures that people are now cutting down forests to grow sugarcane to produce bioethanol. I mean, there are trade-offs for everything. Sometimes by pretending to be more conscious, you're actually also damaging another kind of habitat. So there have been those decisions in this as well. But in general, their contribution to greenhouse gases is much lower as compared to the fossil fuels. So there's still a healthier choice compared to fossil fuels, and majorly because of the fact that we're using what would otherwise be food waste to produce biofuel. And I know for sure that the McDonald's in Islamabad sends its oil and converts it into biodiesel. So there are those examples even all around us, and I think they should be acknowledged and appreciated, and we should think about those when we think about future and future energy need and demand. And bagasse is kind of the waste that remains from a sugarcane that can be used for the production of ethanol, or sometimes it's the waste that remains after production of bioethanol. So this term, if you're learning about biofuels or speaking or reading about biofuels, you'll come across it very often. So we've kind of discussed this. I mean, I'll let any one of you talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So we said that the net energy could be low. We said, or moderate or high, or we said there could be no GHG emissions. But we also said that they could be inefficient based on how much solar light can actually hit the things. But Hassan, would you like to tell your peers, what does a typical solar cell look like? What does it contain?
So if you're talking about the material, as in how it could be bad for the environment, is that the part you want me to tell them about?
No, just what the material is. What is it made of? Is it silicon? Is it other forms of silicon? What is it?
It's currently, the vast majority of solar cells that are commercially available are silicon. A more newer technology right now is gallium arsenide, which we're still working on. Though it's not used as widely, but it may replace silicon to quite an extent.
Right. So most of the solar cells, they kind of contain silicon or another form of silicon. I know they're being replaced by some other glass tech. At least the commercial areas that are developing are telling you that they're more efficient compared to the rest. But we spoke about the net energy, and the net energy could vary in simple applications versus high heat or electricity production applications. And I kind of wanted to make that difference clear in this slide. But I think another thing that is a biggest criticism to these renewable sources is cost. So how costly are these? How costly is what you're working on, Hassan?
So the idea right now is that the efficiency is basically going to help cut down on costs in the first place. Because the materials that we have found that have the certain effect that I'm working on, it's called hot carrier solar cells. It basically uses the energy that is generally lost to heat. Because most of the energy that the solar cell absorbs, it loses it as heat, and then the remaining energy is then used for electricity. What I'm trying to do is to utilize that heat energy. So besides the material, the major cost saving is going to be the efficiency itself.
Right. I think we're going to talk about efficiency in a while, but we spoke about wind energy, and some of you said that they're if not designed properly, they can kill birds, especially because when we're putting them off the shores, and we know that a lot of birds use that route to travel, especially migratory birds. It could do that, but most of the windmills that are designed, or wind turbines that are designed such that the birds could just pass through it without being harmed. And there are low noise levels associated with, depending on where you're living, if you're living close to it. And some people, for example, I wouldn't like for a wind energy, no matter how fond I am of renewable energy and how much I wish for it to be around me, I think visual pollution is something that I cannot deal with. And maybe I'm also one of those people who think that it could cause visual pollution. But I think in terms of the availability, its net energy is said to be high, and it can reduce the cost of electricity, which is what all of us eventually want, for the cost to be reduced. And it's said to be easy to expand, because you just put these huge structures with kind of turbines and generators, and just wire it, connect it to the wire, and then you can make electricity available. Azhan has raised his hand.
Yes, so if you want me to like explain the composition of a solar cell, I can like explain it in a little bit non-technical terms, if
Go
it's okay.
Go ahead, Azhan.
So basically, a solar cell consists of a like layer of p-type silicon placed to next to a layer of n-type silicon. So basically, n-type layer is such a layer in which we have an excess of electron, and in the p-type layer there is an excess of positively charged holes. So like, which are definitely due to the lack of valence electron. Like, so there is a potential difference, right? So and near the junction of the two layers, the electron on one side of the junction, like n-type layer, move into the holes on the other side of the junction, which is the p-type layer. This creates an area around the junction called the depletion zone, in which the electron like fill the holes. So when a solar light falls on the surfaces, so it like excite the electron, and this depletion region is like overcome, and due to this we can like the electrons flow, and we can like connect an external circuit to uh, uh, like use as an energy or electricity. So I think it will be less technical, and just to get some basic idea how it works.
Yeah, so we essentially want in the electricity, we essentially want for the electrons to flow, right? That's how we generally define electricity. So as long as
Yeah.
that's being allowed, and I think that's what we wanted to say happens in a photovoltaic cell, and that's why electricity can be generated using photovoltaic cell or a solar cell. And but why is energy so important, and how do we drive and where do we drive our energy from so important? We looking at the previous lecture, we discussed issues relating to water, we discussed issues relating to air, We discussed issues relating to biodiversity, and all of them were connected with fossil fuels. And what do we use fossil fuels for? For energy. So I think fossil fuels and energy have an intense relationship, because all of the energy mediums are eventually what we need these resources for, whether it's in the form of light or heat or anything else. That's why we are relying on these sources, or cooking our food, or many other functions. And how can we, like Hassan mentioned, that how can we make it more useful, and how can we make it more beneficial for the environment? So the first thing would be, of course, to, if we're using fossil fuel, or if we continue to use fossil fuel for electricity generation, for anything else, to make sure that everything else is efficient, that the net energy is high, and the waste, or heat waste, or in general energy waste, is low. Only then would it last longer. Like, another big problem is that we are using these forms of energy inefficiently. We're using appliances. We very proudly, we say that this air condition was installed by my grandfather or somebody else, not thinking how that old rugged appliance would actually be very, very energy inefficient. And just quickly looking at the chats before I move on, how are wind turbines causing visual pollution? Okay, I mean, like I said, for some people, they're visual pollution. For me, they're visual pollution because I like to look at my mountains and the river without anything placed in there. Some people really like this. Like, some people like the sight of a solar panel. Or it just gives them, it just makes them happy that such a form of energy is available close to them. But to me, I was just talking about myself, and maybe some people like me who consider it visual pollution, that it's the otherwise natural sight that was visible to them is not present there anymore. But it cannot be called visual pollution for everybody. It would only be visual pollution for people who think of it as visual pollution. And yeah, so we're producing, consuming fossil fuels, and it's causing a lot of environmental and health impacts. And we can control it if we use some of these renewable energy sources. Now let's jump to fossil fuels. I've been mentioning fossil fuels all along. I've told you that fossil fuels majorly refer to coal, oil, and natural gas. And we have heard them in our everyday life, from our day-to-day activities. People who live in colder regions, it's very normal for them to burn coal in the house because its net energy is high, and because it's keeps the house warmer and takes a long amount of time to burn slowly, keeps the household warm, and you prefer for it to be in the house as a source of heat. And as we've mentioned before as well, that naturally it's just the organic matter that has remained there for thousands of years under high temperature, under high pressure. So let's say peat, which could be a part of our soil, which is degrading organic matter, is not coal. But if a lot of temperature and pressure and time is allowed, it could turn into lignite. And that lignite could over time turn into bituminous. And that bituminous could eventually turn into anthracite, which is this black coal that we see around us. High quality, highly desirable, high energy content. They say that the sulfur is low. So generally they say that the finer the coal gets, the pollution level would go down. So of course you would expect for it to be used or preferred in places that are cold, or in places where electricity generation and many other functions are dependent on this source of energy. So you extract coal from somewhere, from underground, you find it, you extract it, you bring it. What happens in a general power plant that is run by coal is that it first has to go to the boiler. So coal is burnt, in the boiler, water is then taken to the turbines, which then generates electricity and is sent to the grid. So whatever we're talking about right now, whichever form of energy, whether it's solar, hydro, wind, it has to be connected to a grid for people to eventually benefit from it. When we speak about solar energy and its use in electricity, I'm not just talking about a single solar cell above your rooftop, which is connected to one bulb. I'm talking about using that renewable resource as a energy supply or electricity supply for the whole region, or let's say for one community. Then there is a lot that needs to be done to get to that level. And right now we're doing it very decentralized, has no connection with the grid. And some people are actually what they can do, and there is a market here. So people who are from economics, and probably Dr. Mahmood, if you're generating your own electricity, let's say using solar, using hydro, or using anything else, if you're giving it to the grid, if you're sending it to the grid, the excess energy that you're producing, you can claim credit. So you can get money, or you can not pay for your bills, because whatever you're getting from the grid, you're kind of returning it back to the grid, and it nullifies. And it could also create that market opportunity where if I have a lot of solar panels above my house, if I am storing a lot of electricity and it is actually connected to a grid, especially if I'm an industry, then can I send it to the grid? And can I create a market opportunity from it? And could this be one of the incentives to make renewable resources, or to bring renewable resources into action? And then our grids, which have probably become older, are they suitable for such a connection? Is there room for such a technology to exist in developing countries like ours? Are our grids smart enough to and intelligent enough to be able to absorb that? And what do we need? So there's like another area where perhaps the electrical engineers could contribute more. But there's a lot of, if what I basically just want to raise here is a point of thinking about the incentives that could be developed at individual level to make it a national priority. So you don't have to wait for the government to bring in a project for you, but you start small, your village starts small, and your village is able to connect to the grid, or to the eventually where the electricity is going to be supplied to all the people. And of course, there's a lot of other nuances that are attached to it. You're burning the coal is going to leave behind something, and it's called toxic ash. Now we know what coal releases into the atmosphere as well. So you would expect for that, the water, of course, to be condensed and the heat to be wasted or reused in any other application. And the toxic ash has to be disposed. While whatever you filter, so let's say the air that you filter, and it could contain fly ash as well. So if you're capturing that, then the stack would just allow for the smoke to go out. So just for you to visualize what a typical power plant that's running on coal contains as components in it. And are there many advantages of coal? Like we said, it's present, it has huge resources, you can extract it, it has a high energy yield, it's always there, you can store it, it's not, you can always store it in huge quantities and continue to use it, but it is polluting our environment, it is disturbing our land. Because I think, as Han mentioned, land disturbances and the scale at which lands have been disturbed for coal, as well as oil, as well as gas exploration, has been a lot. And I think that's also something that you could think about in terms of pollution of land or the lithosphere when we are looking for these fossil fuels or non-renewable forms of energy. And their costs are low. That we say that their costs are low if environmental costs are not taken into account. If you take the environmental costs into account, then they could be they could create a lot of impacts into the environment. Now, when I showed you the filter and I said that the ash or the coal ash has to be disposed of, and it's also called toxic ash because it contains a lot of heavy metals, and the ash in itself is not useful. I've seen some people who, for example, burn coal in the north, use that ash for their crops. Not very ideal. Yes, of course, it contains carbon, but it could also contain heavy metals and other things that shouldn't be used with your crop. But with this coal ash comes the fly ash. So there's very fine ash that comes from the burning of coal, which can go out of the stack or the pipe. And that fine ash can serve as particulate matter, right? And it's also unhealthy. So unless you have a way to capture it, it will escape into the environment and it will contribute to air pollution. And for fly ash, what we do is we kind of capture it into the stack, bring it back, and use it in cement. And I just wanted to mention that coal can be converted into natural gas and gasoline, and those processes have different names. And Nadia has a question.
Ma'am, whatever you said about this flying particulate matter, so are there any improvements, or is there any technology that they use in the north to capture that? Because I haven't seen such a activity happening over there.
Yeah, we don't do that in the north, but we don't use it in huge quantities, Nadia. We're not talking about millions of tons in a power industry. We're talking about probably 1 bag a winter or 2 to 3 bags a winter that we use to kill the cold. And of course, the stack or our pipes could contain the fly ash at the end, but because the scale is so small that their dilution could be the solution. But if you've looked at, for example, Gilgit, if you go out of Gilgit, and Gilgit doesn't have a lot of coal, it doesn't need coal because the wind is not harsh. Just from the wood burning, there is like a huge smoke cloud on the Gilgit city. And I experienced it when I was going back from Islamabad to Gilgit. We couldn't land because it was the pilot couldn't see the airport, and we just came back to Islamabad because everyone was burning wood. So I think there are those, it could be small scale. It's not as toxic as the ash that's coming from coal, but it's still, for a small amount of time, it still creates a nuisance that I think needs flagging, and people need to do something about it, because with more population, more homes, more burning of wood, we could even end up causing a lot of deforestation, and we already are, especially in the Diamir area where a lot of these trees are. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we need to, as individuals, from wherever we are, from whatever we are doing, we need to think about it.
Yeah, but ma'am, I don't think so. There's a solution or alternate way to keep themselves from considering the chill in winter times at that area. So, I mean, what can you suggest to them? I mean, everyone.
I would be mean to live in the city myself and to expect them not to use that to kill the cold. I would hope that some of these solar energy, some of these wind harnessing can happen for at least warming their homes. I think solar energy is plenty. We can use that to warm our house, like Hassan was saying, to warm water and then run that water around the house to make sure the house is warm. For those stacks, what we could do probably is make sure that they're built in a way or built in a shape where most of those ash are contained inside. So even in those pipes, there's a lot of smoke that builds in. So if we could do that, and if we could stop it from getting to the air, but we also need to think about where would we throw that ash. So for just wood, I think it's fine, but if you're using coal, then it's not fine, especially if it's not refined. And I don't think we ever check the quality of coal that's going in areas like Koita or Hunza or other places. So yeah, I mean, this is a topic that we need to discuss, and people need to have the knowledge about it to be able to think about it. I mean, not before finding solution, just to think about what can we, what is it and what can be done to make sure that this doesn't happen the way it is happening. And turns out that we have very little time. So like the coal, oil and gas formation takes over a longer period of time. Mostly oil and natural gas are found under the ocean. So there is a phenomena called fracking, which you might have heard about, especially if you're studying politics, economics. In the context of UK, you must have heard about fracking a lot. This slide, I just put it there because I mentioned gas and crude oil being the source of gas. So let's say if crude oil is heated, then at certain temperatures, you can get different kind of fuels. So diesel has the lowest boiling point would be for gas, and down to asphalt. So all of these are byproducts of crude oil that we've discussed in the oil spills or mentioned in the oil spills. So just for you to know what I mean when I say diesel oil or aviation oil. What is the source? Crude oil is the source. And the net energy is high, of course, that's why we prefer it, but the environmental impacts are high. The environmental price is high. The price we pay in the form of pollution for biodiversity is really high. These are all very simple points. I think you can just go through them yourself. We've heard different terms, and because we were at the topic, I thought I would mention these 3 terms to use as well. CNG is simply compressed natural gas, which is majorly methane and carbon dioxide. So up to 95% of it could be methane, and then up to 25% of it could be carbon dioxide, and then the rest of it is nitrogen, oxygen, and other materials. But that we use it as a fuel, and we often say that it's less polluting or better out of compared to coal and oil. And that's why it's generally preferred in vehicles and in other power stations. And liquefied petroleum gas is basically prepared from crude oil, and it, unlike the methane, it contains butane or propane, and therefore LPG has lower GHG emissions compared to CNG and LNG, I think. And the liquefied nitrogen gas is simply cooling it down, bringing down the temperature such that all of the gas, which otherwise would have taken a lot of space, is just compressed into one tiny cylinder, and you can use it in the house. And Hassan has a question. So why coal extraction prices are going up? No new coal is being generated. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going up because whatever easy results.
Just a correction.
Yes.
I wanted to ask why they're not going up.
Why they're not going up? Oh, okay. Yeah. So basically we have, what do? Why do you think is US not taking a lot of its oil and gas reserves out or coal reserves out? Because they know that very soon we're going to run out of them. The world is going to run out of them. So we say between 2050 and 2100, we're probably going to run out of most of these fossil fuels that are available. And a lot of countries, like the Middle Eastern countries, are capitalizing on the use of fossil fuels, and it's, it gives them money. But some countries are storing it for the future. And because it's inland, I don't think that I think the cost is going up because it's now the cost to ensure environmental sustainability as well. So before this, people would just go, like I said, explore, not find, leave everything as junk there and go back. Now the public is standing up and asking them not to do it. They even stop them from doing some of these drills, particularly in the oceans. And I maybe the monetary value doesn't change much, but I think the social value or the social retaliation towards it is actually increasing, and people are stopping what you call extraction of these or going against the extraction of these. As far as the monetary value is concerned, I'm not too sure about it, but I think in terms of the reserves being present in the countries and countries capitalizing on it, they are going on because everyone wants to be wealthy and powerful, and that's why they are doing what they're doing. And natural gas, we kind of studied it. Fracking, as I mentioned, is hydraulic fracturing. So when you go deep down in the ocean, when you dig those deep wells, when you fracture the rocks. And why do you fracture the rocks? Because you want to see if there's oil and gas in there. And sometimes you don't find it, sometimes you find it. But people are standing up against this. And especially, I think, in the case of UK, during the times of Boris Johnson and many other people, you would have seen how people would always affiliate his face with a no-frack poster because they're really against the environmental implications. And the degree of awareness there of an individual citizen is really high compared to what we have here. And that's why everyone is coming out and speaking against it and sometimes stopping projects. And especially for big companies like BP and Shell, they've had to stop a lot of their projects. And we said that energy efficiency is important. It's important because even if we're using fossil fuels, we could prolong the supply. We could reduce the imports. We could increase the reserves for a longer amount of time. We could save on money, and we could reduce the environmental degradation. And of course, there can be a lot of debates. For example, I've put a car where your traditional engine could use bioethanol or could use your traditional biodiesel or oil or petroleum, and it could also be simultaneously using electricity or a battery that is charged by electricity, and that way you could reduce the impact of the pollution. And these cars are called hybrid cars. So if you're thinking why hybrid cars are so expensive, that's because they're doing a lot of things in there. So people who like cars, I would really, because I'm not a very pro technology person, I don't know a great deal about cars, but if you're into cars, I'd really encourage you to go and see how these hybrid cars are changing, how the fuel sources are changing, how, for example, if you know what kind of fuel is compatible with ethanol. So they say high octane value, high this, and you can mix a certain quantity of a certain fuel with the ethanol or biodiesel and use it in your cars. Yes, Hamza.
Ma'am, I wanted to comment this hybrid technology is now pretty old. Now we have cars completely running on electric battery.
Yeah, they are. And then, could you just do it at home, or would you expect for stations to be there? As in
both options are available.
And
both options are available. You can charge your cars and at home as well, and at stations at work.
Yeah, well, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, there are a lot of cars that are now completely that run on electricity. There are a lot of hybrid cars that could use a combination of these fuels, or there are cars that could entirely run on biofuel. So you don't need, because initially it was still in interventions, so you needed these hybrid cars and you needed a little bit of mixing, but now there are cars that completely, or even trucks that completely run on biodiesel, bioethanol, and the fuels that could have been harvested from electricity. But one thing that I mentioned before, and I would like to mention it again, is that bringing an electric car from a power station that runs on coal is not healthy. It's not benefiting the environment. It's benefiting the environment a little bit, but if you're using electricity and the actual source still is coal, then I think it would probably be wise to also make sure that the electricity that you're using for the electric cars comes from renewable resources. So those small extra interventions on thoughts on whatever environment friendly product you switch to, make sure that there everything else that's associated with it is also based on renewable. Or when we speak about energy efficiency, it could just be as simple an action as changing your lights, your older inefficient lights, with a light that's LED and could use much less energy. So it depends. I mean, your level of commitment could vary. And because we were talking about this, I thought I would use your previous knowledge on electromagnetic radiations and mention infrared technology to find how insulated your homes are. And when we said that we're building now the buildings such that they're more energy efficient, they harvest more energy, they could be warmer in the cold and colder in the summer, then you insulate your buildings properly, and you design such. And green architecture has become a very, it's very in the Western world, where you want architects who would make your buildings as green as possible. So it was just an indication towards that, just to get your attention to the fact that you could check the efficiency of or the insulation of your household with as simple as a meter that tells you, with an image, how much heat you're actually releasing and what's the loss there, and you could reduce the loss there too. And I think quickly, I just want to show you this diagram that tells you about the net energy that's available to the household, and then what else could contribute to it, and where is the energy released, and whether it's house water or whether that's air conditioning or whatever. I think when you speak about energy efficiency, you have to think about everything that uses energy that could be replaced with renewable, combined with renewable, or how could you change few things, like for example, if you're using HVAC, how could you change the air conditioning, like switch the air conditioning off for some time, or do alternative air conditioning. So sometimes the SSC building is freezing cold even in July. So why do we need to dissipate that much energy just to keep our cells feel like we're sitting in Antarctica when we're actually sitting in Lahore in July? So all those tiny little things, I think I just wanted to make a mention of that, but also for you to think broader than just changing the light from incandescent to an LED. It's the overall energy intake of your building and how you could capitalize on making sure that you reduce your energy waste as much as you can and increase your energy efficiency as much as you can. And that brings us to nuclear energy. Who here has looked at the Chernobyl video and would like to discuss it? And why have so many people left the class? Which one of you watched the video? Daniel did, Nadia did, Hamza did, Taiba.
Yes, ma'am. In the video, they basically talked about how there was this disaster in 1986 of this nuclear power plant, and basically when this power plant, the workers didn't follow the safety protocols, and several power surges occurred inside the reactor, and it basically goes on to say that that explosion affected thousands of people, lives were affected, and that land is still uninhabitable today. You can't, and yeah, and they tried to drop it on the reactor, but it didn't really help as much as
And you might have
they
also seen
hoped
that they had dropped like lead,
it
make sure it is
would.
Taiba, your house is your voice.
And then they tried to clear.
Your voice,
Um,
Taiba, your voice is breaking a little bit, so I'm going to intervene and tell you that yes, you're very right. That's exactly what happened. Let me see who else can I take. Who would like to talk about the other video where the biodiversity was being monitored by a biologist? A new hand could help me listen to a new voice. Okay, Manal, you can go ahead.
So the second video was about how the wildlife in the surrounding area in Chernobyl was affected. So basically, they studied the birds and the insects, and there was also certain vegetation that was studied. So what they found was that birds' beaks were deformed, and then they also had a greater tendency to have tumors. And then the spider web formation was also very strange, like it wasn't like a normal spider web. So, and also the biodiversity of the area was greatly reduced because of the radiation levels. Because obviously the human population was not allowed to be in the vicinity of Chernobyl, but wildlife continue to inhabit the place. But there was a lot of deformity, and this affected the ecosystem in that area as a whole.
Exactly. That's very well explained, guys. Thank you, Taiba and Manal. And yeah, they said that it could be used as a biomarker. I think something that we mentioned in the biosphere lecture, that biomarker, bioindicators, sometimes a species could be used to tell you how degraded the environment is. And those deformed beaks, the mutations in the birds, they told you that even though so many years have passed, the radiations are still lying around and they're still impacting life there, or let's say the eggs or the genes there. And he kind of compared it to another nuclear disaster which had happened in Japan, which is called Fukushima. And Chernobyl is again one of those classic case studies that everyone knows about in the field of environmental sciences, on how things can go wrong, and sometimes just because of human negligence. And this can be used in multiple aspects. So just to quickly tell you what nuclear energy actually is and how does it derive energy, you're basically using a neutron to hit a uranium that has been enriched by taking uranium ore off the surface of Earth, and it releases extra electrons, and in that process it also releases a lot of energy. And this process is called exothermic, because when you hit an electron or a uranium ion with an electron, then it releases further electrons, and then that releases a lot of energy. And and of course that energy then can be used to heat water, and that water can be used to run turbines, and that turbine gives you electricity or any other power that you want. But it is difficult to contain them. It does mean that because they are going sort of wild, this reaction is happening, and that's why it's called fission. It's kind of like a dhamaka that happens when you hit one, it triggers a lot of other reactions, which is the same as the first one that you hit. And you need a control rod. You need to control it. You need to make sure that you are not over exploiting this reaction. And even though the chances of accidents are really, really low, when they happen, they can have really, really huge consequences on the environment because of the same things that Manal and Taiba were saying. And just to show you this graph, which kind of says the same thing that I just said. And in this process, from mining a uranium to enriching it, to storing it, to using it for power production, to then discarding the waste. I think the waste is one of the biggest problems here as well, because it still has their half-lives are really long. They could still emit a lot of radiations after they're used in these setups. And right now, the biggest problem, environmental problem with these nuclear wastes is the fact that you have to store them, and you have to store them for thousands of years. And one of the researchers that, there's a lot of research happening in Oxford on this, and between a lot of universities in UK. And one of them is focusing on how can you safely discard this nuclear waste back into the earth. So they go down to a rock, they discard it there, and then they cover it there. And they could use like grouts of silica to make sure that it's contained in the rock. And sometimes it just makes you think, why would you go through all the trouble of extracting it, bringing it to the surface? Again, its net energy is high, but also the energy that is used to keep it, to maintain that, to stop that fission from happening when you don't want it to happen, or to extract that energy. It's a lot of knowledge-based energy extraction work, and not everyone can do it. So I think that's what I wanted to say here. And it comes with its own advantages and disadvantages. And like I said, the waste could be a nuisance. What do you want to say, Adine? I can let you speak.
I just wanted to say at the end, like when the discussion about the video about biodiversity was being discussed. So I just wanted to show that in the end of the video, they mentioned that now the species which were in the vicinity of the Chernobyl area were adapting to these radioactive conditions, and that's it.
Yeah, like first of all, the life isn't really coming back, and the life that's coming back is adapting to it, and it's adapting in its own way. So he was also kind of studying that. So I'm going to let you conclude the session. What have you learned? If 3-4 people who got to speak very little would like to conclude something about the renewables, something about the non-renewables, something about its impact on climate, I can then finish the lecture. Hamza, do you want to speak, or did you raise your hand before?
Ma'am, I raised my hand before, but like we can just like conclude and say like fossil fuels are very bad.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of these are used against each other, by the way. For example, a pro-fossil fuel lobby would speak against the nuclear waste or the nuclear energy for the same reason that, yes, GHG emissions aren't high, but look at the impact Chernobyl and Fukushima and its ability to become a war material, because nuclear weapons are also something else that create a problem. So they could use this against the lobby that wants fossil fuels not to be used. So sometimes they're used against each other, and I think it will be interesting for people in politics and business to know how certain negotiations happen, especially if you end up negotiating for BP and Shell and companies like those who make money out of these fossil fuels. Adin.
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to conclude this lecture by saying that even though we have the common idea that we should replace these fossil fuels with the renewable energy sources, but today we learned that it is not that easy because of the waste of energy and other like the initial cost and other reasons. So even though this is an alternative form of energy, but we should keep on looking for other forms of energy which could be more efficient in producing energy than these.
You are muted.
Interesting.
Dr. Fauzi, you're muted.
So on the fuels, we know that every kind of fuel has its pros and cons, and I think we can just use the one that's more beneficial. So why do we use natural gas over coal and oil? Because it's better than the other two. Then why should we use renewables compared to the fossil fuels? Because they're much better than the others. But does that mean that if there are any problems in efficiency, if net energy, in our lifestyle, in the way we live our lifestyles, we should also make sure that we're switching those as well. Now there is a problem, and the problem is the midterm crisis number 2. 50% of you want the midterm to be on 4th, and does anyone want to change their vote and become?
Ma'am, we can we add another option like having a midterm after 7 November?
Yeah,
Because
Khuda,
our TOEFL
I came here to teach you a course. Now I've become a survey person on. I mean, it depends. Do most of you think that it should be on the 7th of November? I don't.
after 7th of November.
Logi. Well, let's have it next year.
Like it can be 8 November, 9 November, or whatever. if we can have an option.
What should I do? How do I ask you guys? You're 40. Should I do an online survey? Should I do the survey on LMS? Because some people are not here, so maybe that vote will change. But what should I do now? Because I started this poll for the fact that a lot of you requested me to reschedule it to 4th. So I just want to make sure that those who are coming from 2nd to 4th then don't have the same request. But help me, guys.
Ma'am, 2nd November is fine because I have midterm on 4th November as well.
Yeah, all of you just think for yourselves. And I have to think for all of you. Okay, I'll do one last poll on LMS. And
ma'am, can I just ask one question? Aren't our vivas going to be scheduled like beforehand? So all of that is going to be on either the 2nd or the 4th?
No, your vivas would be after the mid. And I would keep it that way because then you'd have prepared better for the viva.
Okay, thank you.